She was the poor little rich girl, an heiress who inherited a fortune worth billions in today's money, but died alone in a hotel room with only a few $1,000s in liquid assets left to her name. Her name was Barbara Hutton, and her life was a whirlwind of 7 disastrous marriages, unimaginable extravagance, and deep private tragedy. How does a dynasty built on thrift and the simple nickel and dime produce an heiress whose life becomes a global symbol of wasted wealth and sorrow? To understand, you have to go back to her grandfather, Frank Woolworth. He was a humble farm boy who, with a single brilliant idea, the 5 and 10 cent store, built the largest retail empire on earth. He was a titan of industry who changed how the world shopped and crowned his success with a skyscraper known as the Cathedral of Commerce. This is the story of the rise and fall of the House of Woolworth, a tale of an empire built from nothing and a family that was destroyed by everything. It's a journey into the heart of ambition, innovation, and the haunting truth that the greatest fortunes can demand the cruelest price. Our story doesn't begin under the bright lights of a city, but in the deep, quiet soil of Rodman, New York. Frank Winfield Woolworth was born on April 13, 1852, into a landscape that demanded everything and gave back only what was earned through sweat and calloused hands. This was post-Civil War America, a nation still nursing its wounds, a time when the rhythm of life was dictated not by the clock, but by the sun and the seasons. His parents, John Hubble and Fanny McBriar Woolworth, were farmers of modest means, their English and Scots-Irish ancestry rooted in a tradition of stoicism and endurance. John Woolworth was a man of the earth, practical, pragmatic, and perhaps a bit weary. For him, life was a series of tangible problems to be solved. A fence to be mended, a field to be plowed, a harvest to be brought in before the first frost. He likely saw his son's daydreams as a frivolous distraction from the urgent, relentless work of survival. There were no silver spoons in the Woolworth household, no inheritances to fall back on. Their wealth was measured in bushels of wheat and the health of their livestock. It was a world of stark realities, where a bad harvest could mean a winter of hunger. But Fanny, Frank's mother, saw something different in her boy. While his hands may have been clumsy with a plow, his mind was always worrying, calculating, imagining. She saw a restless energy, a spark of ambition that couldn't be contained by the boundaries of their farm. It was a quiet, observant intelligence. Frank wasn't like the other farm boys who dreamed of adventure on the frontier or glory in the military. From his earliest days, his ambition was singular, peculiar, and utterly prophetic. He wanted to be a merchant. This wasn't just a fleeting fantasy. It was an obsession. He and his younger brother, Charles Sumner, would spend hours playing store. But this was no ordinary childhood game. Frank was the meticulous proprietor. He would gather his merchandise, polished stones, colorful leaves, discarded buttons, bits of broken crockery, and arrange them with an almost religious care. He'd create displays organizing his wares by color and size. Charles would be the customer, but Frank dictated the terms. He was experimenting, learning the fundamental language of commerce in the most primitive of settings. He was discovering the secret alchemy that turns a mundane object into a desirable commodity. He was learning even then the psychology of the sale. This game, played out in the dirt of a New York farmyard, was the first unwritten chapter in the history of a retail revolution. It was the blueprint for an empire, drawn by the hands of a child who saw a world of possibility far beyond the stone fences of his family's farm. Frank's formal schooling was, by modern standards, rudimentary. It ended when he was 16. The farm needed his hands, and a higher education was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. But the dream of the store, the world of commerce, never left him. He felt a desperate, gnawing need to escape the life of drudgery he saw laid out before him. It was his mother, Fanny, who provided the key. Sensing his quiet desperation, she scraped together a loan, a testament to her unwavering belief in him. It was just enough for 2 terms at a business college in the nearby city of Watertown. That loan wasn't just money, it was permission. It was a mother's blessing to chase a dream that his father likely found incomprehensible. For Frank, leaving the farm for Watertown was like stepping into another world. It was his first taste of the life he craved, a life of numbers, ledgers, and the exciting, chaotic energy of the marketplace. He was leaving the world of planting and harvesting for the world of buying and selling, and he would never look back. Watertown, New York in 1873, was a bustling hub of commerce, a place where farmers came to sell their goods and city folk came to buy them. For a young man fresh from the farm, it was intoxicating. After finishing his business course, Frank landed a job, but it was far from the merchant prince role he envisioned. He was hired as an apprentice, a stock boy, at Augsbury and Moore's dry goods store. The pay was a meager $10 a week, a sum that barely covered his board and lodging. The work was grueling and anonymous. Long days were spent in the dimly lit stockroom, hauling heavy crates, unpacking merchandise, and sweeping floors. His hands, once calloused from farm work, now became sore from lifting bolts of fabric and barrels of nails. He was at the very bottom of the retail hierarchy, invisible to the customers who browsed the well-appointed counters upstairs. This was not the world of commerce he had dreamed of. It was a world of physical exhaustion and social invisibility. To make matters worse, when he was finally given a chance to work on the sales floor, he was an abject failure. Frank, the boy who could meticulously organize a make-believe store, was awkward and shy in front of real customers. In the 19th century retail world, salesmanship was an art of persuasion. It involved haggling, charming, and a certain theatrical flair. A good clerk could convince a customer they needed something they had no intention of buying. Frank had none of these skills. He was too earnest, too quiet. He couldn't bring himself to push a product he didn't believe in or to haggle over prices. His quiet honesty was a liability. His sales numbers were so poor that his boss, William Moore, in a move that must have been deeply humiliating, cut his pay from $10 a week to $8.50. He was told in no uncertain terms that he was essentially worthless as a salesman. For any other young man, this might have been the end of the dream. The shame and disappointment could have easily sent him back to the farm, tail between his legs. But Frank possessed a unique combination of quiet sensitivity and stubborn resilience. The humiliation stung, but it also ignited a fire in him. Relegated back to the stockroom, he became an obsessive observer. He watched everything. He saw which items customers picked up, examined, and then put back down. He noticed the tables piled high with what the store called job lots, odds and ends, out-of-season goods, items that just wouldn't sell. This was the store's dead weight, a collection of commercial failures gathering dust in the corners. He saw baby bibs, thimbles, sewing notions, cheap handkerchiefs, all perfectly good items, but they were lost in the cluttered, variably priced chaos of the store. The problem, he realized, wasn't the merchandise, it was the system. A customer might be willing to pay 10 cents for a handkerchief, but if it was sitting next to a bolt of silk priced at several dollars, it seemed insignificant. There was no clear value proposition. And then the idea began to form. It was a synthesis of his childhood games and his professional humiliation. What if all these forgotten items were gathered in one place? What if they were all given one single, incredibly low price? A price so low that it required no thought, no haggling, no salesmanship at all. A price that transformed the act of buying from a calculated decision into a simple, satisfying impulse. He approached his boss, Mr. Moore, with his proposal. We can imagine the scene. The skeptical, world-weary store owner listening to this awkward, failed farm boy turned clerk. Frank suggested taking all the slow-moving junk and putting it on a single table near the front of the store. And here was the radical part. Everything on the table would be priced at 5 cents. A nickel. Not a 99-cent sale, which was just a clever marketing gimmick, but a simple, honest 5-cent price point. Moore was deeply skeptical. It seemed absurd. Selling items for a nickel would surely lose the store money. But the merchandise was essentially worthless as it was, taking up valuable space. With nothing to lose and perhaps a bit of pity for his earnest young employee, he grudgingly agreed. He gave Frank a pile of red cloth to drape over a makeshift table and told him to give it a try. Frank worked with a feverish intensity. He gathered the forgotten treasures from the stockroom, cleaned them, and arranged them on the red draped table with the same care he had once used for his polished stones. He hand-painted a simple, bold sign, "Any item for 5 cents." The next day the store opened. At first not much happened, but then a few customers, drawn by the bright red cloth and the bold sign, wandered over. They picked up a thimble, 5 cents. They examined a baby bib, 5 cents. A small wave of disbelief, then excitement, passed through the store. People started crowding around the table. The merchandise, which had sat unwanted for months, began to vanish. Customers weren't just buying one item, they were buying 3, 4, 5 things at a time. The sheer joy of the bargain was irresistible. By the end of the day, the table was completely bare. It had sold out. In that single, stunningly successful day, Frank Winfield Woolworth had not just cleared out some old stock. He had proven a revolutionary theory of retail. He had discovered that a low fixed price could generate more profit through high volume than a high variable price could through individual sales. He had stumbled upon the magic formula for mass market consumerism. And in the stunned silence of his boss and the jingle of nickels in the cash drawer, the humiliation of being a worthless salesman was washed away. He may not have been able to sell a single expensive item, but he had just discovered how to sell everything to everyone. The 5 and dime empire was born in that moment on a humble red-draped table in Watertown, New York. That triumphant day at Augsbury and Moore's was a personal vindication, but for Frank, it was also a call to action. He now possessed a powerful, proven idea, and he was consumed by the need to build something of his own with it. Working for someone else was no longer an option. The taste of success, however small, had ignited his ambition into an inferno. He scraped together every penny he had, and with a small loan from his former boss, a man now convinced of his protégé's strange genius, he accumulated a starting capital of just over $300. It was a meager sum, a shoestring budget on which to build a dream. But for Frank, it was everything. He chose Utica, New York, for his first venture. On February 22, 1879, with a heart full of hope and a store full of 5-cent goods, he opened the doors to Woolworth's great 5-cent store. The concept was a pure, undiluted version of his initial experiment. Every single item, from stationery to kitchen gadgets, cost a nickel, and he introduced another innovation that was unusual for its time: open displays that allowed customers to browse and choose items themselves. The merchandise was laid out on open counters. Customers were invited to browse, to touch, to handle the goods without the intervention of a clerk. In an era where most merchandise was kept securely behind counters, this was an act of profound trust in the customer. It was an invitation, a democratization of the shopping experience. Initially, the novelty worked. The people of Utica were intrigued, and sales were brisk. Frank must have felt a surge of exhilaration. This was it. The dream was becoming a reality. But the initial excitement soon faded. The store's location was poor, situated on a side street with little foot traffic. More critically, he had misjudged the market. A store selling only 5-cent items had a limited appeal. Once customers had bought the few things they needed, there was little reason to return. The inventory was too narrow to sustain repeat business. Within a few weeks, the flow of customers slowed to a trickle. The dream turned into a nightmare as he watched his small investment evaporate. The first Woolworths store was a failure. It closed its doors in May, just a few short months after it had opened. The failure was crushing. He had lost nearly all his money. The humiliation was immense, far worse than having his pay cut. He was back at square one, but now he was saddled with debt and the bitter taste of defeat. Lesser men would have quit, but Frank's resilience, forged in the hardships of the farm and the disappointments of his early career, held firm. He did not see the failure in Utica as a rejection of his core idea, but as a flaw in its execution. He analyzed his mistakes with a cold, clear eye. The location was wrong. The product mix was too limited. He needed to learn, adapt, and try again. He retreated to his parents' farm, but not in defeat. He was regrouping. He sold off his remaining stock to pay his debts and began to plan his next move. A friend suggested he look at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a thriving agricultural and industrial city with a large population of working-class German immigrants, people who understood the value of a dollar, or in this case, a nickel. The same friend also gave him a crucial piece of advice. Don't limit yourself to just 5-cent items. Add a 10-cent line, double your price ceiling, and you will exponentially increase the variety and quality of goods you can offer. It was a brilliant suggestion, and Frank seized upon it. On June 7, 1879, with a new slightly larger loan and a stock of carefully selected merchandise, he opened his second store in Lancaster. The sign on the front read Woolworths 5-cent and 10-cent store. The addition of the 10-cent items was transformative. It allowed him to sell slightly larger, more substantial goods, small tools, better quality kitchenware, toys, and more elaborate decorations. From the moment the doors opened, the Lancaster store was a phenomenon. The city's working-class families flocked to it. Here was a place where they could afford not just the necessities, but small luxuries. A mother could buy a ribbon for her daughter's hair, a father could buy a new pocket knife, a child could afford a small toy with their own saved pennies. It was a place of affordable abundance. Frank's innovations, the open displays, the fixed prices, the central cash register that sped up transactions, created a lively, bustling, and efficient shopping environment. The profits were immediate and astounding. He reportedly made back his entire investment within weeks. The failure in Utica was instantly erased by the overwhelming success in Lancaster. Frank Woolworth hadn't just opened a successful store, he had perfected his formula. He had created the 5 and dime, a retail concept that would not only make him a millionaire, but would fundamentally change the fabric of American society. He had given the common person purchasing power, dignity, and a sense of inclusion in the burgeoning consumer culture of the Gilded Age. The Lancaster store still stands today, a monument to a second chance and to the birth of a retail empire. The runaway success of the Lancaster store proved that Frank's formula was not a fluke. It was a repeatable, scalable model for retail revolution. But he knew he couldn't build an empire alone. He needed partners, trusted allies who shared his vision and his relentless work ethic. And who could he trust more than his own family. His first and most important recruit was his younger brother, Charles Sumner Woolworth. Charles was in many ways the perfect foil to his visionary older brother. Where Frank was the dreamer, the innovator, the sometimes erratic genius, Charles was the steady hand. He was pragmatic, organized, and possessed a keen operational mind. He was the ballast to Frank's sail. In 1880, Frank brought Charles into the business, setting him up with his own store in Scranton, Pennsylvania. This wasn't merely an act of brotherly generosity, it was a strategic masterstroke. This partnership became the nucleus of one of the most unique business structures of the era, the friendly rival syndicate. Frank had no interest in creating a top-down, centrally controlled corporation, at least not at first. Instead, he fostered a network of entrepreneurs, all bound by family ties and shared self-interest. He encouraged his cousin Seymour H. Knox to open a store. He partnered with his former colleague from Augsbury and Moores, Fred M. Kirby. He brought in other relatives and trusted associates. The model was ingenious. Each partner owned and operated their own stores, giving them a powerful sense of ownership and the incentive to maximize their own profits. However, they all operated under the Woolworth banner, and crucially, they pooled their purchasing power. By buying merchandise in enormous quantities directly from manufacturers, they could negotiate prices far lower than any independent store owner could ever hope to achieve. This was the secret to their success. The autonomy and drive of individual entrepreneurs, combined with the massive economic leverage of a syndicate. They were friendly rivals. They would sometimes compete for prime locations in the same town, but they also shared information, strategies, and buying resources. Frank was the undisputed leader, the source of the core idea, but he created a system where everyone could get rich alongside him. It was a decentralized, rapidly expanding web of 5 and dime stores, spreading like wildfire across the industrial towns and cities of the Northeast. Charles proved to be an exceptionally capable leader in his own right, overseeing the rapid expansion throughout Pennsylvania. Stores popped up in Reading, Harrisburg, and Wilkes-Barre. The syndicate pushed into New Jersey, Delaware, Connecticut, and back into Frank's home state of New York. By the late 1880s, less than a decade after the triumph in Lancaster, the syndicate controlled over 20 stores. By 1889, the number had swelled to 21, a testament to the power and speed of their expansion model. Their target market was the backbone of industrial America, the factory workers, the miners, the immigrant families who were flooding into the nation's cities. These were people who had been largely ignored by the traditional dry goods stores and fancy department stores. Woolworths offered them a retail experience that was clean, bright, and welcoming. There were no judgmental clerks, no intimidating price tags. It was a store for them. Frank was a relentless innovator, not just in pricing but in merchandising and store management. He was one of the first retailers to understand the power of location, often paying a premium for corner lots on the busiest streets, what would come to be known as Main Street. He meticulously planned the layout of his stores, creating long aisles and strategically placing impulse buy items like candy and nuts near the cash registers. He was a pioneer of data analysis, long before the term existed. He would obsessively track sales data, identifying which items were hot sellers and which were duds, constantly refining his inventory to match customer demand. He also cultivated a distinct corporate culture. He hired ambitious young men, often from backgrounds as humble as his own, and trained them in the Woolworth way. He created a system of promotion from within, allowing a stock boy to rise to the level of store manager and even partner. He demanded hard work and loyalty, but he offered a genuine opportunity for upward mobility. he was building not just a chain of stores, but an army of dedicated merchants, all indoctrinated in his revolutionary retail philosophy. The farm boy was becoming a general, and his friendly rival syndicate was the powerful, fast-moving force that was conquering American retail, one nickel and dime at a time. The Woolworth Syndicate was a revolutionary force, a sprawling, decentralized network of stores that was rapidly rewriting the rules of American retail. Frank Woolworth and his friendly rivals had unleashed a commercial juggernaut built on the simple, powerful alchemy of turning nickels and dimes into mountains of gold. But as the 19th century bled into the 20th, the very structure that had enabled their explosive growth was beginning to show its limitations. An army of individual entrepreneurs, no matter how friendly or brilliant, was not the same as a unified empire. And Frank Winfield Woolworth, the merchant prince, now dreamed of an empire. The syndicate, for all its strengths, was becoming a logistical nightmare. While they benefited from pooled purchasing, each partner still ran their own mini fiefdom. This led to inconsistencies. A store in Scranton might have a different feel, a different standard of cleanliness, or a slightly different product mix than one in Buffalo. As the number of stores soared past 100, then 200, maintaining the core Woolworth way became an immense challenge. Frank was a man obsessed with details, the width of the aisles, the polish on the brass fixtures, the neatness of the candy counter. He understood that the brand's power lay in its consistency, in the promise that a customer could walk into any Woolworths in any town and have the exact same clean, bright, and affordable experience. The syndicate model, with its patchwork of ownership, threatened to dilute that promise. Furthermore, the world of business was changing. The era of the trust in titans, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, had demonstrated the immense power of consolidation. To compete on a national and even international stage, Woolworths needed to be more than a loose affiliation. It needed a single corporate identity, a centralized command structure, and a formidable presence on Wall Street. The future, Frank knew, lay in incorporation. The process of bringing these powerful, independent-minded partners under one corporate roof was a delicate and complex negotiation. These were all self-made millionaires, men who had built their own fortunes on Frank's initial idea. There was his steady brother, Charles, who managed a vast and profitable territory. There was his cousin, Seymour H. Knox, a brilliant merchant who had expanded into groceries and other ventures. There was Fred M. Kirby, whose chain of stores was a dominant force in its own right. These were not underlings, they were kings in their own kingdoms. The negotiations, which stretched through 1911, were a high-stakes game of diplomacy and finance. We can imagine the tense meetings in smoky, wood-paneled boardrooms in New York City. Lawyers and bankers pored over ledgers, calculating the value of each man's chain of stores, haggling over stock allocations and positions in the new corporate hierarchy. Frank, as the originator of the idea and the largest single operator, was the natural center of gravity. His vision was to create a single colossal entity, the F.W. Woolworth Company, which would absorb all their combined 596 stores. It was a breathtakingly ambitious proposal. He had to convince his partners to trade their autonomy as owners for stock certificates and board seats in a much larger, more powerful, but also more impersonal entity. Ultimately, the logic of consolidation was undeniable. On January 12, 1912, the deal was done. The F.W. Woolworth Company was officially incorporated, a retail behemoth born overnight. Frank Winfield Woolworth was named its president. The other partners became vice presidents and major shareholders. The company went public, and its stock debut was a sensation. Frank and his partners, already wealthy from their store's profits, became titans of finance, their net worth exploding into the stratosphere. The farm boy from Rodman was now one of the richest men in America. As president, Frank's leadership style was a unique blend of grand vision and obsessive micromanagement. While he plotted global expansion, he was equally concerned with a dusty shelf in a store in Peoria. He was famous for his unannounced store visits. He would stride into a store, his eyes missing nothing. He would check for fingerprints on the glass counters, inspect the neatness of the merchandise displays, and observe the efficiency of the cashiers. Store managers lived in a state of perpetual nervous anticipation of a visit from the old man. An anecdote often told was of Frank spotting a burnt-out light bulb in a store's ceiling fixture. He didn't just tell the manager to fix it. He stayed and timed how long it took for a clerk to get a ladder and replace the bulb, lecturing the manager on the importance of maintaining a bright, welcoming atmosphere. To him, every single detail contributed to the customer's experience, and therefore to the bottom line. He ruled his new corporation not with an iron fist, but with an inspector's magnifying glass, ensuring that his original, perfect formula was replicated with absolute fidelity across his vast and growing dominion. Frank Woolworth's ambition was not the kind that could be contained by oceans. The consolidation of his American empire was not an end, but a beginning. He saw the five and dime concept not as an American phenomenon, but as a universal one. The desire for quality, affordable goods, he believed, was a fundamental human impulse that transcended culture and nationality. His gaze turned eastward across the Atlantic to the old world of Europe. He began making scouting trips abroad, particularly to England and Germany, the industrial powerhouses of Europe. He walked the bustling streets of London, Paris, and Berlin, not as a tourist, but as a retail anthropologist. He observed the shopping habits of the working classes, browsed the cluttered market stalls and the formal, intimidating shops. What he saw was an opportunity. European retail was largely tradition-bound, often divided along rigid class lines. There was nothing quite like the bright, open, democratic space of a Woolworths store, where a duchess and a factory girl could, in theory, shop for the same 10-cent item side by side. His first international foray was a logical, less risky step into a familiar culture: Canada. In 1907, the first Canadian Woolworths opened its doors, and it was an immediate success, proving the model could be easily transplanted. But the true prize, the ultimate test of his vision, was Great Britain. The move into the United Kingdom in 1910 was a massive gamble. Many of his American colleagues and British advisors warned him against it. Britain, they argued, was not America. Its society was deeply stratified. The class system was a powerful, invisible force that dictated everything, including where one shopped. The idea of a cheap store, they feared, would be met with snobbery and disdain from the middle classes, while the working classes were thought to be too bound by tradition to embrace such a brash American concept. There was also the entrenched local competition to consider. Frank ignored the naysayers. He had an unshakable faith in his formula. He understood that the desire for a bargain was a great leveler. He assembled a team, sent them to England, and began methodically planning his invasion. The first challenge was the name. Five and dime was a distinctly American term. It needed a British equivalent. After much deliberation, they landed on a stroke of marketing genius: nothing over 6p. It was simple, memorable, and perfectly captured the essence of the fixed-price model for a British audience. He chose Liverpool for his first beachhead. It was a bustling port city with a large industrial working class, a perfect demographic for his new venture. He secured a prime location on Church Street, one of the city's main shopping thoroughfares. He poured immense resources into making the store a showpiece, even grander and brighter than its American counterparts. The fixtures were polished mahogany, the lighting was brilliant, the displays were immaculate. He wanted to shatter the preconceived notion that cheap had to mean nasty. On November 5, 1910, the first British Woolworths opened its doors. The response was not just successful, it was pandemonium. From the moment the doors were unlocked, a massive crowd surged into the store. They were drawn by a combination of curiosity and the irresistible allure of the 6-penny price point. The store was so packed that merchandise was being swept off the counters by the sheer press of bodies. People were fainting in the aisles. The staff was completely overwhelmed. Within an hour, Frank had to make the decision to lock the doors to prevent more people from entering. The situation outside grew so chaotic that the Liverpool police had to be called in to control the crowd, which snaked for blocks down the street. It was a sensation unlike anything the British retail world had ever seen. The press was captivated. Newspapers that had been skeptical were now running breathless accounts of the American shopping marvel. Frank had not just opened a store, he had unleashed a cultural phenomenon. The success in Liverpool was instantly replicated in other cities across the UK. The 6-penny store became a national institution almost overnight. The British gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams, proving that his vision was truly global. The quiet boy from Rodman, New York, was now a titan of international commerce, an innovator whose ideas were reshaping the way the world shopped. By 1910, Frank Woolworth was more than just a rich man. He was a force of nature, a king of commerce. His empire of nickels and dimes stretched across a continent and an ocean. But for a man of his monumental ambition, a sprawling, invisible empire of stores was not enough. He needed a symbol. He needed a monument that would stand as a permanent physical testament to his incredible journey, a structure that would scrape the sky and announce to the world that the humble farm boy had not just arrived, but had conquered. He dreamed of building a cathedral of commerce. His travels in Europe had filled him with an admiration for the great Gothic cathedrals of the Old World, Notre Dame, Cologne Cathedral. He was awed by their scale, their beauty, their sheer defiant permanence. They were monuments to faith and power, built to last for centuries. He wanted to build something of that same magnitude in the heart of the modern world, New York City. But his cathedral would be dedicated not to God, but to the engine of the new century, commerce, his commerce. This wasn't just about building a headquarters for his company. It was a deeply personal quest. It was an act of defiance against a world that had once dismissed him. His building would tower over their mansions. It would be the tallest, most magnificent structure in the world. And it would be built not on inherited land or railroad monopolies, but on a foundation of nickels and dimes. He found his architect in Cass Gilbert, a man who shared his taste for grand, historical styles. Woolworth became the ultimate patron, involving himself in every single detail of the design and construction. He and Gilbert forged a powerful partnership. Frank wanted a Gothic design, and Gilbert delivered, creating a masterpiece of neo-Gothic architecture that was both a romantic throwback and a marvel of modern engineering. Construction began in 1910 on a prime piece of real estate on Broadway in Lower Manhattan. For 3 years, New Yorkers watched in amazement as the steel skeleton of the building rose higher and higher, dwarfing every other structure in the city. The engineering was revolutionary, employing the most advanced techniques of the day. But it was the building's skin, its facade, that was truly breathtaking. Instead of stone, it was clad in gleaming cream-colored architectural terracotta, molded into intricate Gothic tracery, gargoyles, and soaring pinnacles. It looked less like an office building and more like a fairy tale palace. Frank's obsession with detail was legendary. He personally approved the designs for the lobby, which was to be a symphony of marble, mosaics, and stained glass, rivaling any European cathedral. He even had a sense of humor about his own creation. Among the intricate carvings in the lobby were small, whimsical gargoyles. One depicted Cass Gilbert cradling a model of the building. Another famously showed Frank himself counting out his nickels and dimes to pay for it all. And pay for it he did. This is perhaps the most astonishing fact about the Woolworth building. The final cost was a staggering $13.5 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars today. Frank Woolworth financed the construction largely from his personal fortune, paying in cash without relying on major loans or outside investors. It was a pure, unadulterated display of his company's profitability and his own immense wealth. It was an act of supreme financial confidence, a testament to his deeply ingrained belief in fiscal prudence and the avoidance of debt. On the evening of April 24th, 1913, the building was officially opened. The ceremony was a national event. At the appointed hour, President Woodrow Wilson, sitting in the White House, pressed a telegraph button. Hundreds of miles away in New York, that signal instantly illuminated all 80,000 light bulbs in the Woolworth building. The Cathedral of Commerce blazed to life, its Gothic crown a beacon in the night sky. At 792 feet, it was, for 17 years, the tallest building in the world. But more than that, it was the ultimate symbol of Frank Woolworth's life. It was a monument to the power of a simple idea, a testament to relentless ambition, and the final soaring answer of a quiet farm boy to the world. While Frank Woolworth was raising his monument to commerce, the house he built for his family was beginning to crumble. The same obsession that fueled his empire starved his home of affection. He was a titan to the world, but a ghost at his own dinner table. His wealth bought him adoration from millions and an ever-growing distance from the ones who shared his name. At the heart of this quiet sorrow was his wife, Jenny Creighton. She was the girl he had married back in 1876, his childhood sweetheart, a woman from a simple background who had stood by him during the lean years of struggle. She had been his partner in the early days, perhaps even working in the first stores, sharing the dream when it was still small and manageable. But the reality of their life in the 20th century was something she had never bargained for and, it seemed, could never fully embrace. Jenny was a woman who preferred the quiet life. She was uncomfortable with the grand spectacle their lives had become. She had little interest in the lavish parties, the high society circles, or the constant public attention. As Frank's star ascended, Jenny seemed to retreat further into the shadows. While he built them a palatial 35-room mansion on Fifth Avenue, and later a sprawling 60-room Italian Renaissance estate called Winfield Hall in Glen Cove, Long Island, these were not homes in the truest sense. They were showcases, staffed by armies of servants, places where a family could easily get lost in the sheer scale of the opulence. Jenny, it was said, often seemed lonely and isolated within these gilded cages, yearning for the simpler times in Lancaster, for the man he had been before he became a prince of commerce. Frank's relationship with his three daughters, Helena, Edna, and Jessie, was colored by a similar dynamic of love and distance. He undoubtedly adored them, but his primary language of affection became material. His frequent and lengthy buying trips around the world were a necessity for the business. but they also kept him away from his family for long stretches. He would return laden with spectacular gifts, exotic jewelry from India, fine silks from China, antiques from France. He gave them everything money could buy, the finest education, extravagant wardrobes, and a life of unimaginable privilege. What he couldn't give them, it seemed, was his time. He was the powerful, benevolent, but ultimately absent patriarch. His presence felt more through the checks he signed than the conversations he had. The daughters grew up in a world of immense pressure and expectation. They were Woolworth heiresses, American royalty of a sort. Their lives were chronicled in the society pages, their every move scrutinized. They were expected to marry well, to manage their households, and to take their place in the upper echelons of society. It was the middle daughter, Edna, who seemed to embody both the glamour and the peril of this existence. In 1905, she made a brilliant match, marrying the handsome and ambitious Franklin Laws Hutton. Hutton was a rising star in the world of finance, a man who would go on to co-found the powerful brokerage firm E.F. Hutton and Company. On the surface, it was a perfect union, a merger of two dynamic and powerful new money dynasties. They were a golden couple, fixtures in the most exclusive circles of New York, Newport, and Palm Beach. In 1912, they had their only child, a daughter they named Barbara. But beneath the glittering facade of their public life, the marriage was strained. Hutton was a man of immense ambition and a notorious philanderer. Edna, who was known to be sensitive and perhaps fragile, struggled with the pressures of her role and her husband's infidelities. She lived a life of frantic, almost desperate social activity, throwing lavish parties and traveling constantly. It was a life of dazzling surfaces, but one that may have masked a deep and growing unhappiness. The vast Woolworth fortune provided her with every luxury, but it couldn't provide her with peace or a stable, loving partnership. The seeds of tragedy were being sown quietly in the opulent drawing rooms and grand ballrooms of New York's Gilded Age. The great cathedral of commerce cast a long and sometimes very cold shadow. The Woolworth building stood as a magnificent, unassailable fortress on the New York skyline, a testament to an empire at the zenith of its power. From the outside, the facade was perfect, a gleaming symbol of success. But within the gilded walls of the Woolworth family's own life, deep structural cracks were beginning to form. The relentless pressure of maintaining such a vast fortune, of living under the constant brilliant glare of the public eye, was taking a silent, devastating toll. The story of the Woolworth dynasty was about to pivot from a triumphant tale of commerce to a heartbreaking drama of human fragility, and the first tremor of the coming earthquake would center on the golden couple of their generation, Edna Woolworth and her husband, Franklin Laws Hutton. Their marriage had been the society event of the decade, a seemingly perfect union of retail and finance. They were young, beautiful, and astronomically wealthy. They moved in a dizzying whirlwind of extravagant parties, transatlantic voyages, and seasonal migrations between their opulent homes in New York, the summer cottages of Newport, and the sun-drenched estates of Palm Beach. Franklin Hutton, a key figure at the powerful brokerage firm E.F. Hutton and Company, was the epitome of the ambitious, high-flying financier. He was charming, charismatic, and moved through the world with an air of supreme confidence. Edna, the quiet heiress, was his beautiful, elegantly dressed counterpart, but the public image was a carefully curated illusion. Behind the closed doors of their mansions, the reality of their marriage was far more turbulent. Hutton's ambition was matched only by his appetites. He was a known womanizer, his infidelities a poorly kept secret in their elite social circle. For Edna, who had been raised in a strict Victorian household, this was a source of constant humiliation and heartbreak. She was a Woolworth, a name synonymous with a kind of solid, respectable middle-class virtue, yet she found herself trapped in a marriage that felt like a public betrayal. The fortune that was meant to give her everything had, in fact, made her a target for a man who perhaps loved the Woolworth name more than the Woolworth daughter. In 1912, the birth of their daughter, Barbara, should have been a moment of joy, a potential anchor in their stormy marriage. And in many ways it was. Edna adored her daughter, pouring into the child all the love and affection that was so painfully absent from her relationship with her husband. But the arrival of a child did little to temper Franklin's behavior or mend the fundamental fractures in their union. If anything, it may have increased the pressure on Edna, who was now responsible for raising the next Woolworth Hutton heir. She began to suffer from a variety of ailments. In an era when women's health issues were often vaguely dismissed as nervous conditions, she was likely battling severe anxiety and depression, exacerbated by her profound marital unhappiness and the isolating nature of her life. She became increasingly reliant on the medications of the day, particularly Veronal, a popular and potent barbiturate prescribed for everything from insomnia to anxiety. It was a dangerous, addictive substance, but in the early 20th century, it was handed out by doctors with alarming frequency. Her life became a fragile balancing act, maintaining a flawless public facade while privately unraveling. The parties became more lavish, the smiles more brittle, a frantic, glittering dance on the edge of a precipice. The storm was gathering, and its destination was a luxurious suite in New York's Plaza Hotel. May of 1917. America had just entered the Great War, and a pall of anxiety and patriotic fervor hung over the nation. For Edna Woolworth Hutton, the war in Europe was a distant rumble, secondary to the private war raging within her own life. She, Franklin, and their 5-year-old daughter Barbara were staying at the Plaza Hotel, that icon of New York luxury. But the opulent surroundings offered no sanctuary. The arguments between Edna and her husband had reportedly become more frequent, more bitter. The final days of her life were filled with a tension that was palpable even to the hotel staff. On the morning of May 2nd, the illusion of the perfect family shattered forever. The exact sequence of events remained shrouded in the fog of family secrecy and the passage of time, but the outcome was horrific. Edna was found unresponsive in her suite, and the person who made the discovery was not a maid or her husband, but her 5-year-old daughter. We can only imagine the scene, a moment of childhood innocence colliding with the ultimate trauma. A little girl, perhaps looking for her mother to start the day, pushing open a bedroom door to find a scene of terrifying stillness. That single terrible moment would become the foundational trauma of Barbara Hutton's life, a wound that would never fully heal, shaping the lonely, tragic trajectory of the poor little rich girl. The official story was swiftly and carefully constructed. The family doctor was summoned, the authorities were notified, and a narrative was put forth. Edna, it was announced, had been suffering from a painful ear infection, mastoiditis. She had taken her prescribed Veronal for the pain and, in her distressed state, had accidentally taken a fatal overdose. The coroner's report dutifully reflected this, ruling her death an accidental poisoning. It was a neat, tragic, but ultimately blameless story that preserved the dignity of the two powerful families involved. But almost immediately, whispers and rumors began to circulate through New York society. The story seemed too convenient. Friends and acquaintances who knew of the deep unhappiness in the Hutton marriage, who had seen Edna's fragile state, found it hard to believe her death was a simple accident. The word suicide was spoken in hushed tones, a word that carried an immense social stigma in 1917, a mark of shame that a family as prominent as the Woolworths would go to any lengths to avoid. Decades later, some biographers such as C. David Heyman suggested a darker version of events, alleging that powerful family influence may have shaped the official record to avoid the stigma of suicide. These claims, however, remain unproven. We will likely never know the absolute truth of what happened in that suite at the plaza. But whether her death was a tragic accident born of desperation or a deliberate act of despair, the result was the same. Edna Woolworth Hutton was dead at 33, another casualty of a fortune that seemed to promise everything but deliver so little peace. For the patriarch, Frank Winfield Woolworth, the news was an unimaginable blow. This was his daughter, his puss, as he affectionately called her. The man who could control a global commercial empire was utterly powerless to prevent this intimate, devastating loss. He was consumed by a grief that was likely compounded by a terrible gnawing guilt. Had he done enough? Had he seen the warning signs? Had his own relentless ambition and frequent absences contributed to his daughter's unhappiness? He had given her a world of material comfort, but he had failed to give her a world of emotional security. The flawless facade of the Woolworth building now seemed to mock him, its soaring height a stark contrast to the depths of his personal sorrow. The first great crack had appeared in the cathedral, and for the aging merchant king, the world would never be the same. Edna's death cast a long, dark shadow over Frank Woolworth's final years. He was a man in decline, a titan visibly weathered by personal tragedy. The world around him was also in violent flux. The Great War was raging in Europe, a cataclysm that was reshaping the global order. Frank, a man of the 19th century, a believer in progress and the steady, predictable march of commerce, now found himself in a chaotic new era. He threw himself into his work with a familiar intensity, but those who knew him saw that the old spark, the boundless optimism, had been extinguished. He continued his meticulous store inspections, continued to oversee his vast empire, but it was the motion of a man running from a grief that he could never outpace. In the spring of 1919, just under 2 years after Edna's death, Frank began to complain of a toothache while at his palatial Long Island estate, Winfield Hall. In the grand scheme of his life, it was a trivial annoyance, but Frank, like many people of his time, had a deep-seated fear of dentists. The state of dental care in the early 20th century was a far cry from what it is today. Procedures were often painful and frightening, so he did what many people did. He ignored it, hoping it would simply go away. He dosed himself with patent medicines, but the pain worsened. The tooth was abscessed, a breeding ground for a virulent infection. In the pre-antibiotic era, even a simple infection could be a death sentence. The bacteria from the abscess entered his bloodstream, a condition known as septicemia. The man who had built the world's tallest building, who commanded a global network of stores and an army of employees, who could pay for anything he desired in cash, was now locked in a battle for his life against an invisible, microscopic foe. His decline was shockingly rapid. The infection overwhelmed his system. He was struck by blinding headaches and a raging fever. Doctors were summoned to the estate, but they were helpless. The infection was out of control. His family, including his wife Jenny and his 2 surviving daughters, Helena and Jessie, gathered at his bedside, watching in horrified disbelief as the powerful patriarch slipped away. It was a profoundly ironic and tragic end. Frank Winfield Woolworth, a man who personified control, power, and meticulous planning, was brought down by a moment of simple neglect, by a fear he could not overcome. On April 8, 1919, just 5 days shy of his 67th birthday, the founder of the five and dime empire died. His death was a national event. The newspapers were filled with obituaries hailing him as a titan of industry, a classic American success story, the farm boy who had revolutionized commerce. The Woolworth building, his cathedral of commerce, stood as his magnificent tombstone. Flags on all 1,081 Woolworth stores were lowered to half-mast. But behind the public mourning, his death marked the definitive end of an era. The visionary, the restless innovator, the obsessive genius who had built the entire edifice from a single brilliant idea was gone. The company he had created was now a vast, complex machine. It could run without him, but it would never again possess his soul. The House of Woolworth was now left in the hands of his heirs, a dynasty suddenly and tragically adrift. In the wake of Frank's death, the immense scale of his success became fully apparent. When his will was read, the numbers were staggering. His estate was valued at what would be the equivalent of nearly $1 billion today, a colossal fortune built entirely on nickels and dimes. The will dictated that this vast wealth be divided among his family. His widow, Jenny, received a massive inheritance, as did his two surviving daughters, Helena McCann and Jessie Donahue. The control of the family's fortune, once concentrated in the hands of one man, was now dispersed. It was the beginning of a financial fragmentation that would accelerate with each passing generation. With Frank gone, the question of leadership at the F.W. Woolworth Company was paramount. The board of directors turned to the most logical and perhaps only choice, his younger brother, Charles Sumner Woolworth. Charles, who had been Frank's first and most trusted partner, reluctantly accepted the presidency. He was a deeply capable and experienced retailer, a man who understood the Woolworth system inside and out. He had successfully managed his own large network of stores and had been a key figure in the company since its inception. But Charles was not Frank. Where Frank was a visionary who thrived on risk and innovation, Charles was a conservator. His primary instinct was to protect what his brother had built, not to radically reinvent it. He was a cautious, steady hand at a time when the company and the world was on the cusp of enormous change. Under his long tenure, which would last until 1944, the company would continue to be profitable, a reliable blue-chip giant. But the restless, creative energy that had defined its founding years began to fade. The company culture shifted from one of entrepreneurial daring to one of conservative corporate management. The great ship had a new captain, one who was expert at keeping a steady course, but who was hesitant to explore new, uncharted waters. The litany of family sorrows was not yet over. Just 5 years after her husband's death in 1924, Jenny Woolworth, the quiet matriarch who had witnessed the entire improbable journey from the Lancaster storefront to the Fifth Avenue mansion, passed away from heart disease. Her death marked the final closing of the chapter on the founding generation. Her own will contained a provision that would have monumental consequences for the future of the family. She bequeathed a significant portion of her vast fortune, over $26 million, directly to her granddaughter, Barbara Hutton, the child of the tragic Edna. And so at the age of 12, Barbara, the little girl who had found her mother's body, the child now effectively orphaned by her mother's death and her father's emotional abandonment, became one of the wealthiest people in the world. Her total inheritance now stood at a staggering $42 million, a sum almost impossible to comprehend, let alone manage for a child. She was left in the care of relatives, passed between households, a lonely little girl surrounded by unimaginable wealth, but starved of the parental love and stability she so desperately needed. The new generation of the Woolworth dynasty was now in place. Helena and Jessie were society grand dames, their lives revolving around philanthropy, charity balls, and managing their own enormous inheritances. They had little to do with the day-to-day operations of the retail business that funded their lifestyle. The company was in the steady, conservative hands of their Uncle Charles, and the family's greatest fortune and its most tragic legacy was now concentrated in the hands of a lonely, traumatized 12-year-old girl. The stage was set for the saga of the poor little rich girl, a story that would become a global cautionary tale about the corrosive, destructive power of money without love. The great empire Frank Woolworth had built was secure, but his family, his dynasty, was profoundly, dangerously vulnerable. While the F.W. Woolworth Company, under the steady hand of Charles Woolworth, settled into its role as a venerable and unshakable titan of American commerce, the family's greatest fortune was now in the hands of a child who was, by all accounts, the loneliest girl in the world. Barbara Hutton's life story would become a modern-day fairy tale in reverse, a cautionary tale of a princess locked not in a tower, but in a fortress of wealth, a gilded cage from which she would never truly escape. Her journey would captivate and horrify the public for decades, a slow-motion tragedy played out on the world stage. After the deaths of her mother and grandparents, Barbara's childhood became a nomadic existence within her own vast inheritance. Barbara wasn't a child, she was a living inheritance, passed between mansions like a priceless, unwanted vase. She lived in echoing hallways where the staff outnumbered the family, learning early that every smile had a price tag. Her father, Franklin Hutton, would visit not with a hug, but with an inspection, his eyes scanning for flaws, his words a constant reminder of how she fell short. She wasn't looking for a fortune. She was a little girl, desperately looking for a father. She grew up surrounded by adults who were, in one way or another, on her payroll. This created a profound psychological warp in her perception of the world. How could she ever know if someone's kindness was genuine, or if it was simply a performance for the benefit of the heiress? This deep-seated insecurity would haunt her for the rest of her life, fueling a desperate search for validation and making her tragically susceptible to the charms of those who sought to exploit her. She became shy, withdrawn, and plagued by poor health, both real and imagined. She was not a person. She was a headline, a bank account, an heiress. The weight of that identity, thrust upon her by a tragedy she was too young to understand, would prove to be a burden too heavy to bear. The moment that forever sealed her public persona came in 1930. As the nation plunged deeper into the Great Depression, with millions unemployed and bread lines snaking through city streets, the Hutton family decided it was time for 17-year-old Barbara's official debut into society. They planned a ball of such staggering extravagance that it remains infamous to this day. Held at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, the event cost an estimated $60,000, the equivalent of well over $1 million in today's currency. The ballroom was transformed into a magical silver forest. 1,500 of America's social and financial elite attended. The entertainment was provided by Rudy Vallee and Maurice Chevalier, two of the biggest stars in the world. It was a night of breathtaking opulence, a defiant spectacle of wealth in a time of unprecedented national suffering. The debutante ball was meant to be her coronation, her grand entrance. Instead, it was a public relations disaster of epic proportions. The headlines were brutal. One page featured grainy photos of men in threadbare coats lining up for a cup of soup on the frozen streets of New York. On the opposite page, in dazzling detail, was Barbara Hutton, draped in pearls, dancing in a ballroom transformed into a silver forest. The cost of her party could have fed thousands. In one night, she wasn't just a debutante, she became a national symbol of a promise broken, the living embodiment of the vast, cruel gap between the have-nots and the have-everything. It was here that the moniker was born, a headline that was both cruel and tragically accurate. The poor little rich girl. The event, intended to launch her into society, instead alienated her from the public and cemented an image of thoughtless extravagance that she could never shake. She became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. The lonely girl in the gilded cage was now also trapped in the prison of a toxic public image. While Barbara's personal life was being set on its tragic course, the empire her grandfather had built was entering its golden age. The F.W. Woolworth Company, under the conservative but effective leadership of her great-uncle Charles, was more than just a successful business. It was an integral part of the American social fabric. Through the roaring prosperity of the 1920s, and remarkably, through the desolate years of the Great Depression, Woolworths not only survived, it thrived. During the 1920s, the company reached its absolute zenith. It was the largest retail company in the world, a true behemoth of commerce. By 1929, on the eve of the great stock market crash, there were over 2,000 Woolworths stores across the United States, Canada, Cuba, and Great Britain. Its annual revenues topped $250 million, and it employed a staggering 30,000 people. The red and gold sign of a Woolworths was a fixture on the main street of almost every town and city. It was the anchor of the downtown shopping district, a community hub where people gathered. It had a famous lunch counter that served simple, affordable meals, becoming a social institution in its own right. Woolworths was where children spent their first allowance, where families bought decorations for the holidays, and where a person could find almost any household necessity for a price they could afford. Then came the crash of 1929 and the ensuing depression. While other corporate giants crumbled and legendary fortunes were wiped out overnight, Woolworths proved to be remarkably resilient. In fact, its business model was perfectly suited for a time of economic hardship. When people had less money to spend, the appeal of the five and dime became stronger than ever. Customers who could no longer afford the luxuries of department stores flocked to Woolworths for their daily needs. The company's unwavering commitment to low prices made it a lifeline for millions of struggling families. Contemporary newspapers even described it as nearly depression-proof, a rare beacon of stability in a sea of economic chaos. This created a stark and painful paradox. The nation was suffering, but the company bearing Barbara Hutton's family name was more profitable than ever. The source of her immense and now infamous wealth was a business that prospered on the very economic misery that surrounded her. This cognitive dissonance only served to deepen the public's complex feelings toward her. She was the living embodiment of a fortune that seemed immune to the hardships of ordinary people. While the company represented thrift, value, and community, she, in the public eye, represented excess, waste, and isolation. The Woolworths store on Main Street was a place of democratic, shared experience. The life of the Woolworth heiress, played out in the society pages, was a spectacle of otherworldly privilege that felt like a slap in the face to a nation in pain. The company and the heiress, though inextricably linked by name and money, were on two entirely different and tragically divergent paths. As soon as she came of age and gained control of her fortune, Barbara Hutton, embarked on a desperate, lifelong quest for the one thing her money could never seem to buy: true, unconditional love. Her search led her down the aisle 7 times, a tumultuous carousel of marriages that were, with one notable exception, exercises in exploitation and heartbreak. She confused possession with love, lavishing her husbands with fortunes in cash, jewels, and property, hoping to purchase the affection and security she so deeply craved. Her first husband in 1933 was Prince Alexis Mndivani. He was a member of the so-called marrying Mndivanis, a family of self-proclaimed Georgian nobles who had made a career out of seducing and marrying wealthy heiresses. Mndivani was charming, sophisticated, and utterly predatory. Barbara, young and naive, was completely captivated. He swept her off her feet in a whirlwind romance that culminated in a lavish wedding. She paid him a handsome dowry and showered him with gifts. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Once the legal documents were signed, his charm evaporated, replaced by coldness and eventually physical abuse. The union lasted less than 2 years, ending in a messy divorce that cost Barbara a significant settlement. It was a brutal introduction to the world of fortune hunting, setting a painful pattern for the years to come. Next, in 1935, came a Danish nobleman, Count Kurt Haugwitz Hardenberg Reventlow. This marriage would be the longest and, in many ways, the most damaging of her life. The Count was intensely controlling and psychologically abusive. He isolated Barbara from her friends and systematically took control of her finances. However, this union also gave Barbara the one great love of her life, her only child, a son named Lance, who was born in 1936. The Count's possessiveness extended to their son, and when the marriage inevitably crumbled, it led to a vicious and protracted custody battle. The Count's abuse was so severe that, in the late 1930s, Barbara renounced her U.S. citizenship, a move influenced both by her custody disputes and by legal and tax considerations abroad. The marriage ended in 1938, leaving Barbara with deep emotional scars and a lifelong fear of losing her son. Then in 1942, during the turmoil of World War II, came the surprising and glamorous chapter of her marriage to the Hollywood icon Cary Grant. To the cynical public and press, they were Cash and Carrie, another case of a fortune hunter capturing the wealthy heiress. But the reality was far more complex. Grant was already a major star, financially independent, and by all accounts a man of great integrity. He seems to have genuinely cared for Barbara, seeing past the heiress to the vulnerable, frightened woman underneath. He tried to provide a stable, grounding influence in her chaotic life, encouraging her to seek therapy and to distance herself from the sycophants and hangers-on who constantly surrounded her. For a brief time, it seemed she might have finally found happiness. But Barbara's demons were too powerful. Her deep-seated insecurities, her escalating dependence on alcohol and prescription drugs, and the constant drama of her life proved to be too much, even for a man as patient as Grant. She couldn't accept that he loved her for herself, not her money. The marriage ended amicably after 3 years. In a testament to his character, and in stark contrast to her other husbands, Cary Grant refused to take a single penny in the divorce settlement. Tragically, the one man who seemed to love her for herself, not her fortune, was the one she could not manage to keep. Her brief interlude with genuine affection was over, and the carousel of husbands was about to start spinning again, faster and more recklessly than ever before. While Barbara Hutton's personal life was a public spectacle of scandal and excess, the corporate empire that funded her lifestyle was beginning to face its own, much quieter crisis. The world that emerged from the ashes of World War II was a radically different place, and the retail landscape that Woolworths had dominated for half a century was being fundamentally reshaped. The very foundations of the company's success were slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to erode. The post-war economic boom in America created a massive, prosperous middle class. This new prosperity fueled two transformative social shifts: the rise of suburbia and the dawn of automobile culture. Families began leaving the crowded cities for sprawling new suburban developments. Life was no longer centered on the old downtown Main Street. It was reorienting around the family car and the convenience of driving. This was a tectonic shift that the Woolworth Company, with its massive investment in prime downtown real estate, was dangerously slow to comprehend. As shoppers moved to the suburbs, new forms of retail emerged to meet them there. The first suburban shopping centers and strip malls began to appear, pulling commercial energy away from the city centers. Woolworths, for the most part, stayed put on Main Street, becoming a relic of a pedestrian-oriented world in an automobile-centric age. Even more threatening was the emergence of new, aggressive competitors who had learned and improved upon the Woolworth model. Supermarkets, with their vast selections and low prices, began to cut deeply into Woolworth's highly profitable sales of candy, toiletries, and small household goods. And on the horizon, a new type of retailer was appearing: the discount department store. Companies like E.J. Corvette and later Kmart and Walmart were taking the core Woolworths principles of high volume and low overhead and applying them on a massive warehouse-like scale, offering a much broader range of merchandise, from clothing to appliances, at prices the old five and dime simply couldn't match. The culture that once made Woolworths strong now made it fragile. Under Charles Woolworth, caution had been a virtue. Now it was a death sentence. The company wasn't just a sleeping giant. It was a giant chained to its own history, deaf to the footsteps of the predators approaching. The leadership that followed Charles was largely comprised of men who had spent their entire careers within the Woolworth system. They were resistant to change, skeptical of the new suburban trends, and confident that their downtown dominance was unassailable. They failed to invest heavily in the new suburban shopping centers and were disastrously late in developing their own discount store format, the Woolco chain, which would ultimately prove to be a costly failure. The first cracks in the empire were beginning to show. While the company was still immensely profitable, its market share was slowly being chipped away. Its image, once the epitome of modern retail, was starting to look old-fashioned and dated. The slumbering giant was unaware that the ground was shifting beneath its feet. The world was changing, and the F.W. Woolworth Company, the great innovator of one era, was in danger of becoming the great dinosaur of the next. As the post-war world hurtled forward into an era of unprecedented social and technological change, the two great divergent streams of the Woolworth legacy continued on their tragic courses. One was the story of an empire in a slow, majestic, and seemingly irreversible decline. The other was the story of an heiress in a frantic, terrifying, and all too public freefall. Barbara Hutton, the poor little rich girl, entered the final acts of her life, a period marked by a desperate, almost pathological continuation of the patterns that had defined her youth. The carousel of husbands began to spin with a reckless, dizzying speed. After Cary Grant, her search for love, or perhaps for any port in her emotional storm, grew ever more erratic. There was Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Lithuanian nobleman and race car driver, a brief and volatile union. Then in 1953 came perhaps the most infamous and cynical of all her marriages. She wed Porfirio Rubirosa, a notorious Dominican diplomat and playboy, a man whose reputation as a predator of wealthy women was legendary. The marriage was a blatant transaction, lasting only 53 days. It was a humiliating spectacle that cemented Barbara's image as a willing victim, a woman so starved for male attention she would pay any price for it. 2 more husbands would follow, an old friend, the German tennis star Baron Gottfried von Kram, and finally a Laotian prince, Pierre Raymond Don Vin. Each marriage was a brief, hopeful flicker that was quickly extinguished, leaving her more alone and more diminished than before. Her immense fortune, once thought to be inexhaustible, was being relentlessly drained by divorce settlements, lavish and impulsive spending, and the army of lawyers, advisors, and sycophants who now managed and fleeced her estate. But the ultimate, most devastating tragedy of Barbara Hutton's life was yet to come. It centered on the one person she truly loved, her son, Lance Reventlow. Lance had grown up to be a handsome, charismatic man, inheriting his mother's fortune but forging his own identity in the high-octane world of international motorsports. He was a talented race car driver and the creator of the celebrated Scarab sports cars. He was the one bright, stable light in Barbara's chaotic universe. But on July 24th, 1972, that light was extinguished in the most horrific way imaginable. Lance, an experienced pilot, was scouting locations near Aspen, Colorado, in a small Cessna plane when it crashed shortly after takeoff, killing him and his 3 passengers. He was only 36 years old. The death of her only child broke something in Barbara from which she would never recover. It was the final, cruelest blow of fate. The grief was absolute and all-consuming. She retreated completely from the world, becoming a recluse in her penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Her health, always fragile, collapsed entirely. Her addictions to alcohol, amphetamines, and barbiturates, which had plagued her for decades, now spiraled out of control. The vast Woolworth fortune, which had once seemed as boundless as the ocean, was now gone. Decades of astonishing extravagance, disastrous investments, and systematic exploitation had finally taken their toll. The woman who had inherited the equivalent of nearly $1 billion was now in her final days effectively bankrupt. On May 11, 1979, Barbara Hutton died of a heart attack in her hotel room. She was 66 years old, though illness and years of addiction had left her looking far older and frailer than her age. Her funeral was a small, sad affair, attended by only a handful of people. The poor little rich girl, who had spent her entire life surrounded by a crowd, died profoundly and utterly alone. Her story stands as one of history's most searing cautionary tales, a testament to the terrible, destructive truth that a life can be overflowing with riches, yet completely empty of worth. While the last Woolworth heiress met her tragic end, the corporate empire that bore her name was fighting its own protracted, agonizing battle for survival. The slow decline that began in the 1950s had, by the 1960s and 70s, become a full-blown crisis. The company, once the undisputed king of retail, was now a wounded giant, assailed on all sides by younger, faster, and more aggressive competitors. Recognizing the mortal threat posed by the suburban discount stores, the company finally made a belated and desperate attempt to adapt. It began a program of diversification, acquiring other retail chains in an effort to find new sources of growth. The most significant of these acquisitions, a move that would prove to be ironically prescient, came in 1963 with the purchase of the Kinney Shoe Corporation. At the time, it was seen as just one of many acquisitions, a solid but unremarkable business to add to the corporate portfolio. The company's flagship attempt to fight back against Kmart and Walmart was the creation of its own big box discount chain, Woolco. Launched in 1962, Woolco was meant to be Woolworth's champion in the new suburban arena. But the venture was flawed from the start. The company, steeped in its five and dime traditions, never fully understood the discount model. The Woolco stores were often in poor locations. Their merchandise mix was confusing, and they could never match the ruthless operational efficiency and low prices of their rivals. For 2 decades, Woolco bled money, a major drain on resources. Combined with slow adaptation to suburban shopping and fierce competition from discount rivals, the 1983 closure of all U.S. Woolco stores was a devastating blow to the company's prestige. The failure of Woolco made the writing on the wall impossible to ignore. The traditional Woolworths variety store was a relic, an institution whose time had passed. Throughout the 1980s and into the 90s, the remaining five and dime stores became sad shadows of their former selves. They were often tired and dingy, their merchandise seeming dated and irrelevant. They were losing money at an alarming rate. The company's only bright spots were the specialty chains it had acquired over the years, particularly those under the Kinney Shoe umbrella. In 1974, Kinney had launched a new concept store focused exclusively on athletic footwear, a response to the burgeoning jogging craze. They called it Foot Locker. This small niche chain of stores was wildly successful, growing rapidly even as the parent company's core business was collapsing. Finally, the inevitable day came. On July 17, 1997, after years of staggering losses, the F.W. Woolworth Company announced that it was closing the last 400 of its variety stores in the United States. The news was met with a wave of nostalgia and sadness across the country. It was the end of an era, the final nail in the coffin of an American institution. For generations of Americans, Woolworths had been a cherished part of their lives, but nostalgia could not pay the bills. By the end of the year, the last of the red and gold signs were taken down, and the American five and dime, Frank Woolworth's revolutionary creation, was officially extinct. The closure of the variety stores was not the death of the corporation, but its final painful metamorphosis. The company, now a hodgepodge of profitable specialty stores and a dying legacy business, needed a new identity. In 1997, the board of directors made a radical decision. They abandoned the name that had been a household word for over a century. The F.W. Woolworth Company was renamed the Venator Group, a generic corporate name chosen to signal a complete break with the past. The strategy was now clear: shed the old failing businesses and focus on the one area of undeniable strength: athletic apparel. Venator began selling off its other retail chains, focusing all its resources on the explosive growth of Foot Locker and its sister companies like Champs Sports and Eastbay. Then, in 2001, the transformation was complete. Recognizing that the company's future and its public identity were now wholly tied to its flagship brand, the Venator Group renamed itself once more. The new name was Foot Locker Incorporated. The metamorphosis was so total that today many shoppers at Foot Locker have no idea that the company they are patronizing is the direct corporate descendant of the old five and dime store. The stock ticker, FL, traces an unbroken line back to the F.W. Woolworth Company that was first listed on the stock exchange in 1912. It is the ultimate and perhaps cruelest irony of the Woolworth saga. The corporate entity that Frank Woolworth built survived, but only by systematically erasing every trace of his name and his creation. The seed of its salvation, the Kinney Shoe Corporation, was an acquisition made in 1963, a desperate move by a company already beginning to lose its way. And yet in a strange postscript, the Woolworths name has not vanished entirely from the world. In Germany, the Woolworth GmbH chain is a thriving and profitable retailer. In Mexico, Woolworth Mexicana continues to be a major presence. These companies sold off decades ago are now completely independent, but they prove that the original concept of a low-price variety store can still succeed. They are ghost echoes of a fallen empire, a testament to the fact that it was not the idea that failed, but the American company's ability to adapt it to a changing world. In the end, the story of the House of Woolworth is a tale of two ghosts. The first is the ghost of a great company, a retail giant that invented modern shopping but grew too complacent to survive. Its fall teaches a timeless lesson for any empire: innovate or die. The second, more haunting ghost is that of the family itself. The colossal fortune Frank Woolworth built to secure his dynasty became a corrosive poison, breeding loneliness, exploitation, and addiction. Barbara Hutton's life, in particular, is a devastating reminder that the most gilded cages are still cages, and that a heart empty of love cannot be filled with money. Today, the magnificent Woolworth building still graces the New York skyline, a cathedral of commerce that outlasted its creator's empire and his family. It stands as a silent monument to a spectacular rise and a heartbreaking fall, proving that a legacy is not measured in dollars or skyscrapers, but in the quiet lessons that echo long after the gold has faded and the crowds have gone home.